My name is Dr. Alistair Finch. I hold a PhD in geophysics with a specialization in seismic wave propagation and deep Earth resonance analysis. For the 7 years prior to the events I am about to document, I was employed by the United States Geological Survey, where my work was considered respectable, if not exactly groundbreaking. I am, by nature and by training, a man who believes in data, in empirical evidence, and in the fundamental, observable laws that govern our physical world. It is crucial that you understand this. The credibility of the following account rests upon the foundation of my own rationality. A foundation I now fear has been irrevocably fractured. The offer came through a third-party contractor, a faceless entity that specialized in staffing sensitive government projects. The terms were, to put it mildly, exceptional. A 6-month contract with a salary that would eclipse my annual earnings at the USGS, a significant completion bonus, and the opportunity to work with proprietary technology on what was described only as high-priority geological resonance analysis. For a man in my position, it was an irresistible proposition. My professional life had plateaued, and my personal life had recently simplified itself in the form of a quiet, amicable breakup that nonetheless left my apartment feeling cavernously empty. The prospect of a 6-month, high-intensity engagement in a remote location felt less like an exile and more like a focused, lucrative escape. I accepted the position. I submitted to a background check so thorough it felt like a forensic audit of my entire existence. I signed non-disclosure agreements that carried penalties severe enough to ensure I would sooner forget my own name than discuss my work. I was given a start date, a flight number to Las Vegas, and instructions to await further contact upon my arrival. I packed my bags with the detached optimism on a scientist embarking on a challenging new project, entirely unaware that I was, in fact, stepping into a meticulously managed reality where the laws of physics were treated as mere suggestions. The journey from Las Vegas was the first true indication of the isolation I had signed up for. A silent man in a black government-issue sedan drove me north, then east, away from the neon, dusted horizon and into the vast, brutal emptiness of the Nevada desert. The landscape unspooled in a monotonous panorama of baked earth and skeletal creosote, bushes under a sky of punishing, indifferent blue. The silence inside the car was as profound as the emptiness outside. After 3 hours, we turned onto an unmarked, paved road that stretched toward the distant, shimmering mountains like a black, surgical scar on the flesh of the desert. Another hour passed before the facility came into view. It was not the gleaming, futuristic complex I might have imagined. It was a monument to brutalist architecture, a cluster of low, monolithic structures of raw, gray concrete and darkened, reflective glass that seemed to drink the harsh desert light and give nothing back. There was no sign, no fence, no visible security patrol. Only the stark, alien geometry of the buildings rising from the desert floor. It looked less like a research station and more like a mausoleum for a forgotten god. We pulled up to a subterranean entrance, a concrete ramp that descended into the earth. The air that greeted me as the car door opened, was super heated and carried a strange, metallic tang, the scent of ozone and hot stone. My handler, a man named Elias Thorne, was waiting for me. He was tall, gaunt, and possessed a stillness that was deeply unsettling. His face was a mask of professional neutrality, and his eyes, when they met, seemed to be assessing true integrity rather than acknowledging my presence. He did not offer a handshake. "Dr. Finch," he said, his voice as dry as the desert air. "Welcome to Esoterra." He led me through a series of sterile, white corridors that hummed with the low, constant thrum of industrial-grade ventilation. The air grew cooler, drier. Our footsteps echoed with unnerving clarity in the sound-dampening environment. There were no decorations, no informational posters, nothing to suggest human habitation beyond the bare necessities of function. Thorne handed me a security badge bearing my name and photograph, a key to a small apartment in the on-site residential block, and a single laminated card. "Your initial onboarding protocol," he stated, not explained. "Memorize it. Adherence is not optional." I took the card. I am a man accustomed to procedure, to checklists, to the rigorous protocols of a scientific laboratory. I read the card with the detached curiosity of a new employee, encountering a set of particularly stringent corporate policies, attempting to reverse engineer the logic behind each directive. The text was stark, black on white. Rule FAO 70. All personal biometric data must be purged from active terminals by 1900 local time. Compliance note: non-compliance will result in immediate revocation of system access and a mandatory cognitive assessment. Rule 512. All westward-facing exterior shutters must remain fully sealed between 0200 and 0400. Compliance note: visual confirmation is logged automatically. Do not attempt manual override under any circumstances. A Rule FEN 15 fee: food and drink items are prohibited within Level 3 geological analysis. Water is permissible. Compliance note: atmospheric particulates in this sector are highly reactive to complex organic compounds. A Rule FE 21C: do not vocalize any numerical sequences discovered in raw resonance data. Transcribe only. Compliance note: auditory resonance can cause sensor feedback loops. My mind immediately set to work rationalizing them. Rule FAO 7. An extreme but plausible cybersecurity measure. Perhaps biometric data left on the network could create a vulnerability. The cognitive assessment was likely just bureaucratic jargon for a stern talking to and a password reset. Rule 515 fee. Perfectly logical. Sensitive atmospheric sensors could easily be contaminated by organic molecules. I had worked in clean rooms with far stricter rules. Rule 521C also sensible. If we were dealing with highly sensitive resonance detectors, it stood to reason that certain auditory frequencies, even those produced by the human voice, could create feedback and corrupt the data. Rule 512 was the only one that gave me pause. Sealing shutters during a specific 2-hour window in the middle of the night seemed oddly specific. Perhaps it was related to satellite surveillance, or light pollution affecting some kind of nocturnal optical sensor. In any case, it was a simple enough directive to follow. They were strange rules, yes, but they existed within a framework of logic I could accept. I slid the card into my pocket, my scientific mind satisfied that it had solved the small puzzle. My first shift in sub, Level 3, was a study in anticlimax. The lab was a vast, circular room, its walls lined with servers, and its center dominated by a holographic display that currently showed a slowly rotating, translucent image of the Earth's crust beneath our feet. My workstation was one of a dozen arranged in a wide circle, though only 3 others were occupied. My colleagues offered curt nods, but no conversation. The silence was broken only by the hum of the servers and the soft clicking of keyboards. The work itself was fascinating. The raw data streams detailed seismic and geological resonance patterns unlike anything I had ever seen. They were complex, semi-repeating, and possessed a level of structural coherence that bordered on artificial. Yet they were not impossible. I theorized we could be observing a novel form of crystalline stress propagation or a previously undocumented magnetotelluric phenomenon. I spent hours engrossed, transcribing the numerical sequences as per rule Fe 21, feeling the familiar thrill of scientific discovery. The day passed in a blur of focused work. It was 1915 when I finally packed my briefcase, my mind still churning with data. I walked back through the silent, sterile corridors toward the residential block, feeling a sense of satisfaction. It was only as I reached the door to my apartment that a cold knot of dread formed in my stomach. My terminal. In my haste and fascination, I had forgotten to purge my session. I had broken Rule 507 on my very first day. Cursing my own carelessness, I turned and hurried back toward the lab, my footsteps echoing my rising anxiety. The cognitive assessment was probably nothing, I told myself, but the thought of facing Elias, Thorne to explain my incompetence on day 1, was mortifying. As I approached the entrance to sub, Level 3, I slowed. The main door was propped open slightly. I could see a single workstation was still active inside, its monitor casting a flickering glow in the otherwise darkened lab. I crept closer, peering through the gap. It was a senior researcher I'd briefly seen earlier, a woman whose badge read Dr. Aris Thorne. No apparent relation to Elias, I hoped. She was hunched over her keyboard, typing with a frantic, desperate energy. Her screen was not displaying geological data. It was bathed in a pulsing, aggressive red light, and large block letters flashed over and over her key. SSPSRQIRED, Piro Ofo Alatio, O Giderel Fauzo 7. Her back was to me, but I could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her entire body was coiled like a spring. She was muttering to herself, the words too low to be distinct, but the tone one of pure, unadulterated terror. It was not the sound of someone frustrated by a system lockout. It was the sound of someone pleading. I stood frozen for a moment, my own forgotten login completely erased from my mind. The clinical, rationalized world I had constructed around this place began to crack. The cognitive assessment was not a reprimand. The rules were not just quirky corporate policy. I was witnessing the raw, terrified consequence of breaking one. And it was nothing I could explain away with logic. She never saw me. I backed away from the door as silently as I had approached, my heart hammering against my ribs. I retreated down the corridor, the image of her terrified face, illuminated by that pulsing red light, burned into my memory. My scientific curiosity had been my driving force for my entire life. But as I walked back to my small, concrete apartment in the heart of the Nevada desert, I felt it being replaced by something else, something cold and primal. I felt the first sharp prickle of genuine fear. Sleep did not come that first night. My small, concrete apartment, which had initially felt like a Spartan but acceptable temporary home, now felt like a tomb. Every creak of the building, every hum from the ventilation system, was amplified by my fear. I lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling. The image of Dr. Eris Thorne's terrified face seared onto the back of my eyelids. The pulsing red light of the warning screen. The frantic, pleading muttering. It was a scene that defied the sterile, rational environment the facility projected. I had broken the same rule she had. My terminal had been left active, my biometric data unsecured. Yet no one had come for me. No alarms had sounded in my room. My keycard still worked. This lack of consequence was, in its own way, more terrifying than a swift punishment. It implied a system of enforcement that was not automated and absolute, but selective, arbitrary. It meant that someone, or something, had known about my transgression and simply chosen not to act. The thought was chilling. The next morning, I walked to Level 3 with a sense of dread that felt like a physical weight on my shoulders. I half expected to be met by Elias Thorne and a pair of grim-faced security guards. Instead, the lab was just as it had been the day before, quiet and humming with latent energy. There were 3 other researchers present, the same ones from my first shift, but one workstation was conspicuously vacant. Dr. Eris Thorne's. Her desk was wiped clean. Not just tidy, but sterile. There was no personal mug, no stray papers, no indication that a human being had spent hours working there just the day before. It was as if she had been digitally and physically erased from existence. I settled at my own terminal, my hands trembling slightly as I logged in. The system greeted me with the standard interface. No warnings, no red screens. It was unnervingly normal. Throughout the morning, I tried to engage my colleagues in conversation, to casually probe for information. I started with the man nearest me, a portly, balding physicist named Dr. Jian Lai. Quiet morning. I began, my voice sounding strained to my own ears. Dr. Thorne must be taking a personal day. Dr. Lee didn't look up from his screen. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of his head. I would advise you to focus on the data, Dr. Finch. He murmured, his tone flat and final. It was not a suggestion, it was a clear, unequivocal warning. I tried a similar approach with the other 2 researchers and received responses that were either equally evasive or outright ignored. They were afraid. The fear in this room was a palpable force, a low-frequency resonance that vibrated just beneath the surface of the professional silence. Eris Thorne was gone, and we were all expected to pretend she had never been here at all. I took their advice. I threw myself into the work, hoping the familiar comfort of data analysis could build a wall against my growing paranoia. But the data itself offered no comfort. The resonance patterns we were monitoring were becoming more complex, more structured. They were not random geological noise. On my screen, the numerical sequences flowed in long, intricate strings that possessed the hallmarks of a sophisticated language. There were repeating motifs, syntactical structures, and a level of complexity that dwarfed any natural phenomena I had ever studied. My scientific mind reeled with the implications. We weren't listening to the Earth. We were eavesdropping on a conversation. Rule Fate 21. Do not vocalize any numerical sequences. Took on a terrifying new significance. What would happen if one were to speak these numbers aloud? Would it be like speaking a word of power? A command? A name? The temptation to whisper just a short sequence, to hear its cadence, was a maddening scientific impulse that I had to physically suppress. 2 weeks passed in this state of high, strung, silent tension. I followed the rules with the devotion of a zealot. I purged my terminal at 1859 every evening. I never brought so much as a coffee into the lab. I transcribed the endless, silent numbers. And every night, I would lie in bed and think about rule. All westward, facing exterior shutters, must remain fully sealed between 0200 and 0400. It was the one rule that dealt with the outside world. A world I was beginning to feel was not as empty as it appeared. My apartment was on the 3rd floor of the residential block, my window facing due west, looking out over a vast, featureless expanse of desert that stretched to the jagged black line of the distant mountains. Every night at 0200 sharp, a heavy, multi-layered metal shutter would slide down over the reinforced glass, sealing me in with a deafening thud. My curiosity festered. What was out there in the dark that the facility's administration was so desperate to keep us from seeing? The official rationale I'd invented, satellite surveillance, light pollution, now seemed laughably naive. One afternoon, a facility-wide memo appeared on our terminals, a single chilling addendum to the existing protocols. ADDNDMTO-REL-E512. Personnel are reminded that any attempt to record audio from the western exterior of the facility during the Yoder 2500, Yo 400 seal is a Level 4 protocol violation. The facility's acoustic dampening is rated sufficient for all operational requirements. That was it. That was the tipping point. They weren't worried about us seeing something. They were worried about us hearing it. The rule wasn't just about a visual phenomenon. It was about an auditory one so powerful that the thick concrete walls and soundproofed windows of this billion-dollar facility were considered merely sufficient to block it. My scientific training, the very core of my being, that demanded evidence and observation, could no longer be suppressed by fear. I had to know, but I wasn't foolish enough to break the rule directly. I couldn't use a microphone or a camera. I needed a low-tech, deniable method of observation. I needed a witness and had no voice and no memory that could be audited. That night, I devised a simple experiment. I took the plain glass tumbler from the bathroom and filled it with water, placing it carefully on the wide, interior sill of my westward-facing window. My hypothesis was simple. If there was a significant acoustic or vibratory event outside, it might be powerful enough to transmit through the structure of the building and disturb the surface of the water. It was a seismograph of the most primitive kind. I watched the clock, my heart rate accelerating as 002C100 approached. At the precise second, the shutter slammed down, the sound echoing through my small room like a gunshot. The silence that followed was absolute. I turned off the lights and sat in my desk chair, my eyes fixed on the glass of water, a pale circle in the gloom. For the first hour, nothing happened. The water remained as still as glass. I began to feel foolish, my paranoia getting the better of me. Then at 0307, I felt it. It wasn't a sound, it was a pressure. A deep, subsonic thrumming that started at the base of my skull and vibrated down my spine. As a geophysicist, I was intimately familiar with seismic vibrations, with the tremors of the earth. This was not that. This was directional. It was pressing in on the western face of the building, a physical force that the structure seemed to groan against. It was rhythmic, like a colossal heartbeat, or the purr of some impossibly large engine. I looked at the glass. My breath caught in my throat. On the surface of the water, tiny, concentric ripples were forming. They pulsed in perfect synchrony with the vibrations I felt in my bones. The patterns were intricate, geometric, like the somatic figures I had once created in a university lab, but infinitely more complex. They would form, hold for a second, and then dissolve as a new, more elaborate pattern emerged. It was mesmerizing and utterly terrifying. This was the source of the data. The geological resonance was not coming from beneath us. It was coming from out there. The thrumming, the pressure, the impossible ballot in the water glass. It all stopped at exactly 0400. The cessation was so abrupt that the resulting silence felt like a physical blow. I sat in the dark for a long time, my mind struggling to process what I had just witnessed. I had my proof. The rules were not arbitrary. They were a shield, protecting us from a phenomenon that was real, physical, and right outside our walls. I waited until the first hint of dawn grayed the sky before I moved. The shutters were programmed to retract at sunrise. I stood before the window, waiting. With a low hum, the heavy metal shield slid upwards, revealing the harsh beauty of the desert morning. I looked out, half expecting to see some great trench or piece of machinery. But there was nothing. Just sand rock and the indifferent blue sky. My eyes fell to the glass of water. It was still, but my gaze drifted past it to the exterior of the thick, reinforced window pane itself, and then I saw it. My blood ran cold. Pressed against the center of the glass, 5 feet from the nearest ledge and 3 stories up from the desert floor, was a handprint. It was perfectly formed in a thin layer of dust, as if someone had reached out and placed their palm flat against the window during the night. But the hand was impossibly long and slender, and it had 6 fingers. The handprint was a declaration of war against my sanity. I stood frozen before the window for what felt like an eternity, my scientific mind battling a tidal wave of primal terror. My first impulse was to recoil, to scrub the offending image from existence. My second, overriding impulse was that of the scientist. I had to document it, I couldn't use my phone. Any unauthorized photography was grounds for immediate termination, and likely far worse. So I grabbed a notepad and a pencil, my hands shaking so violently that my first few lines were jagged, meaningless squiggles. Forcing myself to breathe, I began to sketch, my mind grasping for the anchor of scientific process. I noted the dimensions. The palm was unnaturally narrow, the fingers elongated to nearly twice the length of my own. The sixth finger branched from the base of the palm, parallel to the thumb, giving the print a grotesque, arachnid symmetry. There were no discernible whorls or loops of a typical fingerprint, only a fine, stippled texture like worn leather. It was pressed against the glass 3 stories up, with no ledge, no scaffolding, no conceivable point of purchase. It was an artifact of an impossible event. I knew I couldn't report it. Reporting it would be an admission that I had, in some way, been observing the window during the O2 400 seal. It would expose me to the same scrutiny that had erased Dr. Eris Thorne. The handprint was my secret, a terrifying piece of data that I alone possessed. As the sun climbed higher, the warmth began to evaporate the thin film of condensation on the glass, and, with it, the dusty imprint began to fade. Within an hour, it was gone, leaving only my frantic sketch as proof it had ever existed. Walking into Level 3 that morning was like stepping into a different reality. The air, once merely sterile, now felt charged with a predatory stillness. The low hum of the servers sounded less like machinery and more like the breathing of a sleeping beast. I looked at the streams of numerical data flowing across my screen, the complex, semi-repeating sequences I had been so fascinated by. I was no longer looking at abstract geological resonance. I was looking at the written language of thing that had touched my window. The thought made my blood run cold. Every number I transcribed felt like handling a venomous snake. My self-imposed isolation was no longer sustainable. I needed an ally, or at the very least, a source of information beyond my own terrified deductions. My gaze fell upon Dr. Janley. He was older than the rest of us, a man who'd likely been at Esoterra for years. He had warned me off once, but the stakes had changed. The threat was no longer a vague administrative punishment. It was a 6-fingered hand on my window. I waited until a lull in the day. When the other 2 researchers had left for their lunch break, I walked over to Lee's workstation. He stiffened as I approached, his eyes fixed resolutely on his monitor. "Dr. Lee," I began, keeping my voice low and steady. "I need to ask you about Rule Fen 15. He didn't move. "The rule is clear, Dr. Finch. No complex organics in the lab. It's a simple contamination protocol. With all due respect," I pressed, "nothing in this facility is simple. I believe the atmospheric particulates mentioned in the compliance note are more than just dust." He finally turned to look at me, and for the first time, I saw past his professional mask. His eyes were filled with a deep, weary fear. "You are a geophysicist, Finch. You study the Earth. Stick to that. Do not study the architecture of your cage." The word cage hung in the air between us. "Something was outside my window last night," I whispered, the confession feeling like a betrayal of my own survival instinct. It left a mark. Lai's face went pale. He glanced nervously toward the sealed lab door. "You saw nothing," he hissed. "Whatever you think you saw, you are mistaken. Forget it. Forgetting is a survival skill in this place." "I can't," I insisted. "The data we're transcribing, it's not geology, is it? It's a signal. It's their signal. And the particulates, they're connected to it, aren't they?" He stared at me for a long moment, a silent battle raging in his eyes. Finally, he leaned in, his voice barely a whisper. "The particulates are receptive. Think of them as a raw medium, Dr. Finch. A substrate. They are inert, microscopic dust. But they are designed to react to two things: strong, coherent resonance patterns and complex organic molecules. The resonance gives them a blueprint. The organics give them fuel." My mind raced to process the horrific implication. Fuel for what? To build. Lee breathed, his eyes wide with remembered terror. To assemble. A few years ago, a technician spilled a few drops of a protein shake near one of the primary server vents. The resonance patterns at that moment were unusually coherent. The dust in the air, it used the protein as a catalyst. It began to coalesce to form three-dimensional, tangible shapes that mirrored the data on the screens. It built a perfect, shimmering replica of a sequence we had just recorded. A string of numbers, glowing and hanging in the air, made of nothing but dust and a drop of spilled protein. I felt dizzy. Rule 15 wasn't about protecting the sensors from us. It was about protecting us from the data. It was to prevent the language of things outside from finding a way to physically manifest inside. Our conversation was cut short by the return of the other researchers, accompanied by a new face. He was young, probably a fresh post, Doc, with a cocky, self-assured swagger. Elias Thorne was with them, his gaunt presence sucking the warmth from the room. "This is Dr. Evans," Thorne announced, his voice flat. "He will be joining the analysis team, focusing on cross-referencing resonance patterns with deep, core temperature fluctuations." Evans gave a dismissive wave to the room. "Just point me at the rocks," he said with a grin, clearly unimpressed by the solemn atmosphere. Over the next week, Evans proved to be exactly what his first impression suggested: brilliant, arrogant, and utterly contemptuous of the rules. He saw them as bureaucratic nonsense, impediments to his real work. He openly scoffed at the prohibition of food and drink, complaining loudly about the lack of decent coffee. Lai and I exchanged worried glances. Evans was a walking protocol violation, a time bomb of carelessness. The inevitable happened on a Tuesday. We were in the middle of a resonance spike, the most powerful and sustained I had yet witnessed. The numbers pouring onto our screens were dense and complex, the language outside growing more insistent, more agitated. The pressure in the room felt immense, the air thick with unspoken tension. And then I smelled it. The rich, unmistakable aroma of dark roast coffee. I whipped my head around. Dr. Evans was leaning back in his chair, a triumphant smirk on his face, holding a large, stainless steel thermos. He had just poured himself a cup. "Relax, people," he said, taking a long, theatrical sip. It's just coffee. What's the worst that could happen? The dust bunnies get a caffeine buzz. Dr. Lee shot to his feet, his face a mask of pure horror.
Evans, you fool!
Put it away! But it was too late. As Evans set the steaming cup down on his desk, a single drop of black coffee spilled over the rim, landing on the pristine, white surface of his workstation. The reaction was instantaneous and silent. The air around the spilled drop shimmered. The microscopic, invisible particulates we had been breathing, the receptive dust, were drawn to it. It was like watching iron filings align to a magnet, but in 3 dimensions. A small swirling vortex of glittering dust, no bigger than a fist, formed directly over the coffee droplet. The liquid was consumed, drawn up into the vortex, not as steam, but as a catalyst. The vortex began to glow with a soft, internal, blue-white light. And then it began to change. With a smooth, silent, and utterly horrifying precision, the swirling dust coalesced. It elongated, twisted, and solidified, hanging in the air, exactly where the steam from the coffee cup should have been, was a glowing, 3-dimensional object. It was a perfect, tangible manifestation of the first numerical sequence on Evans's screen. The number 7, followed by a complex, alien glyph that looked like a stylized, 6-fingered hand. It pulsed with a soft, malevolent light, a piece of a language not meant for human eyes, now given physical form in our sterile lab. Evans stared, his arrogant smirk gone, replaced by slack-jawed terror. The thermos slipped from his nerveless fingers and clattered to the floor. The main lab door hissed open. Elias Thorne stood there, flanked by 2 security personnel in heavy, tactical gear. But he wasn't looking at Evans. His cold, assessing eyes were fixed on the glowing symbol hanging in the air. And on his face was not anger or surprise, but the grim, wary resignation of a man who knew this was not a breach of protocol, but a breach of containment. The silence in the lab was absolute, broken only by the frantic, ragged gasps of Dr. Evans. The glowing symbol, a piece of impossible language given form, hung in the air like a declaration of cosmic treason. Elias Thorne's reaction was not one of panic, but of chilling, practiced efficiency. He raised a small, black device from his belt and pointed it at the manifestation. He didn't speak. He simply pressed a button. There was no sound, but the air itself seemed to scream. The glowing glyph convulsed violently, its light flickering like a dying star. It folded in on itself, the elegant, alien lines collapsing into a chaotic scramble, before dissolving completely, falling to the floor as a shower of inert, gray dust. The 2 security personnel moved past Thorne with a terrifying, fluid grace. They didn't address the protocol violation. They addressed the violator. One clamped a hand over Evans's mouth to stifle his hysterical babbling, while the other lifted him from his chair. If he weighed nothing, he requires recalibration. Thorne stated, his voice as cold and empty as the space between galaxies. It was the most terrifying euphemism I had ever heard. They dragged Evans out of the lab, his muffled cries ceasing abruptly as the door hissed shut. Thorne turned his gaze to Dr. Lee and me. There was no anger, only a deep, abyssal wariness. I see you've been educating our new colleague, Dr. Lee, he said, his tone making it clear he knew everything that had been said. It saves time. You both understand, now, that the rules are not for our convenience. They are for our survival. He gestured to the holographic display in the center of the room. We call it the esoteric anomaly. It is not geological, Dr. Finch. It is biological, or perhaps mimetic. It is an intelligence of immense age and power, trapped deep within the lithosphere beneath our feet. It is not from space, it is from within. It doesn't perceive reality as we do. It sings it. The resonance patterns we record are its language, its thoughts, its attempts to find a sympathetic frequency in our world. This facility is not a laboratory. It is a dampener. A massive, billion-dollar tuning fork designed to keep the anomaly's song from finding harmony with our physical laws. As he spoke, a new alarm began to sound, a deep, guttural klaxon that vibrated in my bones. The primary lighting grid flickered and died, plunging the lab into the stark, crimson glow of the emergency system. On the central display, the translucent image of the Earth's crust vanished, replaced by a swirling, chaotic vortex of the alien glyphs and numerical sequences, all pulsing with an aggressive, triumphant light. The breach, Lee whispered, his face ashen. It gave the anomaly a taste, a foothold. It's pushing, Thorne confirmed, his voice tight. The primary dampeners are fluctuating. It's trying to force a full manifestation. We have one option left. The scoring protocol. My blood ran cold. It sounded like an act of self-destruction. It's a targeted seismic charge. Thorne explained, his eyes locked on me. A last resort. We detonate a resonance pulse of our own, designed to disrupt the specific geological strata where the anomaly is focused. We can't destroy it, but we can detune its camber, force it back into a state of incoherent dormancy. Dr. Finch, your work here is no longer theoretical. I need you to target the charge. You can read the propagation data. You understand the wave mechanics better than any of us. You are the only one who can make this shot. The choice was not a choice. It was a conscription. We ran from the lab, down corridors that now seemed actively hostile. The air was thick with shimmering dust, coalescing in the corners of my vision, in fleeting geometric shapes. The numerical sequences were no longer confined to screens. They were etching themselves onto the concrete, walls in faint, glowing lines, a constant, silent scream. We passed an open doorway to a small break room. On a table sat a forgotten, half-eaten apple. The organic matter had become a nucleus for a pulsating, tumorous mass of crystalline fibers that twitched and grew even as we watched. A grotesque fusion of orchard and alien geometry. Our destination was sub-level 7, the seismic core. The journey felt like a descent into hell. The vibrations grew stronger with every level we descended, the klaxon a constant, maddening heartbeat. The core was a vast, spherical chamber, its walls a mesh of conduits and glowing sensors. In the center, suspended in a web of magnetic containment fields, was the scorer, a massive, drill-like device tipped with a complex array of resonance emitters. A single control console stood on a gantry overlooking it. The vibrations were now so intense that the metal floor hummed, and my teeth ached in my skull. The air was alive with dust, forming and dissolving six-fingered hands that reached for us from the shadows. Lee and Thorne stood back to back, using handheld sonic emitters to dissipate the larger manifestations that swirled around us. "Finch!"
Now!
Thorne yelled over the din. I scrambled onto the gantry, my hands flying over the console. The screen was a waterfall of the anomaly's language, but interwoven with it was the seismic data I understood. I had to isolate the primary frequency of the anomaly, calculate the precise counter frequency, and aim the scorer at a point 5 miles beneath our feet, a task requiring hundreds of minute calculations. As I worked, the numbers on the screen began to speak in my mind. It was not a sound, but a direct transmission of concepts, of knowledge, of promises of understanding the fabric of the universe. A six-fingered hand of pure thought reached into my consciousness, offering to guide my fingers to show me the correct answer. It was the ultimate temptation, the final test of Rule Phi 21. I squeezed my eyes shut, focusing only on the pure mathematics, on the cold, hard physics. I ignored the siren song of the numbers. I saw the target solution, a fleeting window of opportunity. With a guttural cry, I locked in the final coordinates and slammed my palm down on the large, red activation panel. The klaxon stopped. The vibration ceased. The world did not erupt in fire and thunder, but in its opposite. A wave of pure, absolute silence expanded from the scour. It was not the absence of sound. It was the sound of absence. A null wave that erased everything it touched. I saw it wash over the coalescing dust, forms turning them to nothing. I saw it hit Lie and Thorne, their forms dissolving like smoke. I felt it coming for me, a wave of perfect, cleansing oblivion. And then, nothing. I awoke to the sting of grit in my eyes and the heat of a rising sun on my face. I was lying in the sand, miles from the facility, or where the facility had been. In the distance, a vast, smoking crater scared the desert floor, a wound in the earth that was still weeping smoke into the morning sky. I was alone. I staggered to my feet, my body aching. I checked my pockets, my wallet, my keys, and the single, laminated card with the rules. I started walking towards the distant, shimmering line of the highway, a lone survivor of a war no one knew had been fought. I am writing this now from a cheap motel room, hundreds of miles away. I am writing it because I have to. I am the only record. But that is not the only reason. I am writing because the silence did not last. The numbers are still in my head. They are a part of me now, etched into my memory, my DNA. Sometimes I find myself humming a sequence without realizing it. A complex, resonant melody that makes the lights flicker. I can feel the resonance of the earth wherever I go. A low, constant hum that is growing stronger. I am a carrier. I am the escaped song. I fear I am just looking for the right catalyst. A spilled drink. A moment of weakness. A single drop of blood. Just now, as the evening sun slanted through the grimy window, I saw it. There, on the dusty glass, perfectly clear in the fading light. A handprint. My handprint. And it has 6 fingers.